Hi everyone, welcome to Darien Library. Thanks so much for coming out on this warm, very warm evening, unseasonably warm evening. I would just like to briefly mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by our annual Friends of the Library campaign, so thanks so much for your continued support to make programs like these available to the community. Tonight's guest is the author of 10 previous novels, including the international bestseller, The Moment. His work has been translated into 22 languages, and in 2007, he received the French decoration of, please forgive my French, Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres. Jane coached me beforehand. Also, Will Schwalbe, who is the author of the End of Your Life book club, who, by the way, will be visiting here June 5th. He said of our guest's latest book, with 5 days, he has crafted a brilliant meditation on regret, fidelity, family, and second chances that will have you breathlessly turning pages to find out what happened in the past and what will happen next. At once heartbreaking and hopeful, it is a powerful new work of fiction by an internationally acclaimed writer at the height of his powers. And I'd also like to note that I gave this book to my mother for Mother's Day, and I had dinner with her on Sunday, and she told me that she couldn't put it down, so it makes a great gift. Please join me in welcoming to Darien Library, Mr. Douglas Kennedy.
That's fulsome indeed. Thank you. I'm always very conscious of time when I do a discussion like this, largely because I had a horrendous situation once at a book festival in England at the Hay-on-Wye Festival, which is on the Welsh borders, and this is early on in my career, and I was on with a well-known British travel writer whose name I won't mention, but I'll tell you afterwards if you want to know. And basically we were both supposed to go on and do a 40-minute segment each. And we were in the green room beforehand, and he tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Come outside." And he pulled out a joint. And I said, now I was at Bowdoin College in the 70s, I certainly know what that is. I said, "But there are 300 people out there, are you out of your mind?" And he went, no, I can handle it. And I said, "Well, go ahead, my friend, you know, I might have a scotch afterwards." And he got up first, and he spoke for 104 minutes. I timed it. And no one could get him off the stage. And it was about a trip up the Amazon, and there was a whole passage about a meeting with a shaman who sounded like a complete moron, and tantric sex with a she-devil, and the guy's wife was in the third row. It was just unbelievable. So since that moment, I ran into him afterwards. I had 5 minutes at the end. That was all I was allowed it. And he came up to me and said, "I think I went on a little long, didn't I?" I went, "Oh no, Charles, you were so pithy. You were so elegant. And now I know why they call it dope." This will take 30 minutes. And even though I have been up the Amazon, actually, if there was tantric sex involved, that's not going to be a subject tonight. I can promise you that. There's always that sort of question that writers are always asked, which is the light bulb over the head moment. When did it start? You know, how did inspiration begin? I've often explained that, you know, all writers are fundamentally atypical. Certain people work out a novel, John Irving, for example, point by point by point before even putting a word to the page. I am somebody, I make it up as I go along, and even though it's very structured, I actually have to work in that kind of improvisatory nature of just pushing the narrative forward every day. I have a very simple method for writing. It's mathematically boring, but if you're thinking about writing a novel, it works. This was Graham Greene's method, and he's one of my heroes. 500 words a day. 2 pages. 2 typed pages. In the old A4 kind of page that we used to have in typewriters, but 2 typed pages on a computer. Mathematically, if you do this every day, 6 days a week, you have 12 pages times 50, you have 600 pages, which is very much the first draft of that, and it took a year. That whole sort of light bulb over the head moment, when it starts, how it starts. In 2008, I was in the middle of a really nasty divorce, the only one and hopefully the last one I ever go through. And I was at the Court of Justice, the Old Bailey in London, for this hearing. The other side was not negotiating. I said goodbye to my 2 women lawyers. That was very smart, 2 women to defend me. Outside the Old Bailey, and walked across the Thames, across the Millennium Bridge to Tate Modern, wandered in, just decided to look some art for an hour or 2 and just kind of get my head off of other things. There was a major exhibition of Rothko there. Rothko is a favorite painter of mine. I think he is the greatest of American abstract expressionists. And it was the famous Seagram's murals that he did for the Four Seasons, which he withdrew. And I kept looking at them and just thinking of walls. 2 days later, I was in Berlin, where I maintain an apartment. I was walking down Friedrichstraße, and I passed Checkpoint Charlie without even realizing I had passed Checkpoint Charlie. For some reason or another, those 2 notions came together, and a novel called The Moment, which took the next 2.5 years to write, came out of that. Writers' brains fundamentally are quite messy in their own way. And I've often said, frankly, you never know what is going to trigger something which will trigger something else, which will bring you into a novel. 2011, I had been finishing copy edits. Copy edits are, this is where you sort of essentially have a kind of grammatical fascist going through your manuscript and making sure your semicolons and your colons are right and fact-checking everything. I was finishing the copy edits in my house in Maine. Snow was falling. I was actually feeling very good about life. Just thinking after a couple of tough years, it had, this was a good moment. Single, happy, snow coming down, Maine. That night, I was running for a flight in Logan, running late, and I was in the line for security, and there was a woman just off the line. She'd obviously just put someone onto a plane in floods of tears. She was, I would say, early 40s, a very stern New Englandish face, the sort of face you'd imagine John Singer Sargent, if you know his work, would have painted 150 years ago, in floods of tears. And she had her hand on her wedding ring, and she was twisting it madly like this, like it was a manacle. Immediately, the novelist in me began to riff. Okay, she's put her husband on the plane, he's leaving her for another woman. She's put her husband on the plane, she's thinking, I can't deal with this clown anymore, what am I going to do? She's put her lover on the plane, he's going back to his wife. She's put her lover on the plane. She said, I can't stand this, but I have to go back to my husband. You look at any situation, and I think this is where novelists play games with reality all the time, and you're just looking at somebody in the middle of life. You can impose 8 different meanings on what's going on. About 2 weeks later, I was having a break, and my idea of a break, I was in Laos, and I was hiking up country near Luang Prabang, wonderful name, and I stopped in this kind of inn for the night, and there was a German couple in their late 20s, and they were very crusty looking, dreadlocks. You can imagine 5 years from now he was going to be an investment banker in Frankfurt, driving a BMW, and she was wearing Chanel. But basically there they were, and they were having an argument. And the woman turned to the guy and said, "Was willst du?" What do you want? And he turned to her and said, what a question. That immediately went into my notebook. About 5 weeks after that, coming back from a flight from Sydney to London, I sat up in my seat, and the entire idea for this came about. So the woman twisting her ring, what do you want? And what a question. I'll explain more as we go along over the next half an hour or so. For me, I never think about themes when I'm writing novels. They do arrive, but I'm always interested in basically human mess. I think this is one of the reasons why I've been published in 22 countries. I started writing my own contradictions and my own doubts, and then I realized they're shared by a lot of other people. And one thing that interests me enormously is the notion of entrapment, and why most of the time entrapment is often self-entrapment. Why fundamentally we set ourselves up into lives that we don't want. Why we construct the cul-de-sac that basically keeps us imprisoned, and we complain about this, and yet we're the one who has set it up to begin with. My father, when he was 70, my parents had a marriage which was something out of Strindberg. They were always at each other's throats. They tried very much their best as parents, but they were not happy with each other. And when my father was 70, He was over in London. He'd lost his career by this point, but he was doing some consultancy work. And I was living in London at the time, and we had lunch. And he started just talking about how difficult things were with my mother. And I said, look, you're 70. You've done your bit. Your 3 boys are gone. Yeah, I was 41 at the time, 43 actually at the time. And I said, you know, you've got this one asset. Sell the apartment in New York. Give Mom 2/3. She can buy a nice 2-bedroom. What do you want to do in life? He said, I want to live in Maine. I said, you can do that. You know, in those days, you could get a house on the water for about $100,000. You know, you can get a 4x4. You can get your little sailboat. I'm sure you will find actually a little community college or a junior college where you can teach business. And I'm sure you'll also find a nice woman between the ages of 55 and 70 who'd be delighted to be with an elegant, interesting man like yourself. And my father, who is Irish Catholic, no surprise there with my name, from Prospect Heights, Brooklyn, and yes, raised and slapped around by the Christian Brothers, basically turned to me and said, how dare you? I took an oath. I took an oath under God. And he got very, very upset. Freud said once that, you know, all sons in some way or another have to kill the father to move on. I certainly never intended to that, but things changed between us after that night because I could also see his absolute fear and the fact that the idea of a life beyond this, as unhappy as it was just too much for him to actually even contemplate. What's interesting is fundamentally in life, this is something I've always feel, we all construct an identity. Everyone here has an identity. And it's something that you have constructed yourself, possibly subconsciously, but it's there. And even though I'm not really in favor of great kind of sweeping bromides about life, one thing I do feel, and it's one of the sort of better statements I've ever heard, I'll wait till you sit down, about the human condition, came from a now forgotten German romantic poet around the same time as Goethe, and he was named Novalis, and he said something, every one of his poems is forgotten, but he said something that fundamentally, for me, says it all, and it's just 3 words: character is destiny. I think actually that's one of the most interesting statements written about the human condition. And character, I think, is very much destiny. And is it our destiny to choose that which shortchanges us? Are we frequently selling ourselves short out of the belief that we need to answer to a higher authority? It's sort of like the person who basically says, I had a friend in college who I think was the most gifted music theater composer I'd known. He was on his way to be Sondheim. He became a lawyer. And I remember saying that the pressure was on family-wise to do so. He's a very successful lawyer. Does he rue this or not? But it's interesting to me how so often people basically work in a very counterintuitive way to what they want because they feel this is sort of what I deserve or what I should be doing. I was involved with somebody after my divorce. Sorry, am I not talking loud enough? Or
Sorry, the mic is not working.
Is the mic not working? Okay.
It's not just me, yeah. That's great.
Okay.
I just recommend moving closer if you're having trouble hearing.
Is that better? I can talk louder. I'm from Manhattan. I can talk very loud. You know? Yeah.
I encourage you to move closer, though.
Yeah, indeed. No, I was just saying that basically, after my divorce, I was involved with somebody in Paris who sort of made the mistake. Writers should never be told anything because basically we're sponges. And, everything you say will be taken down and may end up in a story or otherwise. And I was involved with a woman in Paris who was in publishing and who had this habit of telling me far too many prurient details about all her relationships with men. And this was a Zoftig 6'1" German, and before me, she always said, "You're the tallest man I've ever been involved with." They were all about 5'2", 5'3", and they all had sexual problems, and I heard it all. And basically, a sort of an alarm bell started going off in my head, going, "This doesn't have legs," as they say. But also, why does this person engage in self-sabotage? And sure enough, about 2 or 3 months into this, she started directing this towards me, and I was just gone. And I said to her at the end, you can't do this. You have to actually decide that the glass of water isn't just half empty, but also the last glass of water on Earth and radioactive. And that is a very interesting point of view, frankly, which is how you perceive the world dictates everything. Everything in life is interpretation. When people talk about truths, there are very few truths, really. If you've been through a divorce, you know this. There was a marriage. Now there are 2 competing versions of it. Who's right here? Well, me, of course. But the truth is, nobody. It's just 2 stories. Same event, you shared the same bed, you may have had kids, you bought stuff like houses and cars and all this, but there are now 2 completely different versions, and actually no one is in any way right here. And that kind of pulls into another thing I often feel, which is, people talk about being angry at the world or angry at life or such change, but fundamentally, the biggest argument in life you have is the one that you have with yourself. And what also interests me, and this will lead into the book, is that whole idea of you're living a life, and yet you're always thinking about a life you should be having at the same time, the life in parallel. There was a very forgotten, but actually quite wonderful American poet of the 40s and 50s named Randall Jarrell. And he had a wonderful line about this. He said, the way we miss life is life. And I've always felt that very strongly, that, here you're having this existence, but you're thinking, I should actually be doing this in a different situation. And yet, at the same time, life is going forward. And, okay, you're thinking about this, but can you change it into something else? Which is the infernal struggle. Which brings me to 5 days. Like most people at a certain age, I've been in for a scan or 2. I'm sure most people have done this once or another. And when I was going in for a very routine scan, I won't get into what it is, but you can guess, that routine thing you do after 50. I was basically in the waiting room at this hospital in Maine, and there was a woman seated opposite me. I could tell she was a heavy smoker. She had a terrible cough, and she said, I know I have something, and she was explaining why, and I was just saying, take it easy, you don't know. And the woman was whisked off, and then I was actually put into prep, and I waited a long time because, as it turned out, they did find something in her. And I was talking to the woman who is the radiology technologist. I was single at the time. I was flirting with her. She was rather attractive, which was sort of a funny situation, to say the least. But life is full of these wonderful moments. And basically, I said, "How do you deal with that sort of thing?" And she said, "You actually have to be very neutral, because you're seeing bad stuff all the time, and you actually have to defend yourself in an interesting way." I started thinking about this, and a few weeks later, talked to a friend who knew a friend who got me into the radiography hospital, department of my local hospital in Maine, which is in a small town called Amarascotta. I live 10 miles south. And I spent a day there, and it was fascinating. I thought to myself, there are people out there who have to do sort of very difficult work, if you think about people who work in morgues or funeral homes. But also a technologist, a radiography technologist, spends his or her day looking at other people's cancers. And as one of these women told me, and she explained the very rigorous protocol they have to go through, the fact that basically they're not radiologists who are the MDs. They have the medical degree. They're the ones who actually will look at the scans, the MRIs, the X-rays, and can actually make an actual, considered a medical judgment. The technologists, they're as trained as the doctor, but they are basically operating the machinery, making sure the levels of contrast are right, and I explain all this in the book, but also having to deal with frightened people. And I was, I said to this woman, I knew what the answer was. I said, what's the hardest? She said, children, without question. And she said, the hardest thing is the parents. And the hardest thing is seeing what's on the screen and seeing bad news and not being able to say anything and having to actually maintain this mask. So this appealed to my imagination. and Laura was created. Laura is a 41-year-old Maine lifer. She was born and raised there. She's never left the state. Got married young for reasons that were a little rushed and which come out in the course of the book. She had at one time a dream of being a doctor. It got sideways by children, but she has actually had this career as a technologist, and she works in the small Maine hospital. And she's someone who's always been able, in a way, to keep her distance. But she's now into early midlife. Her son is at university, at college, and is having an up and down time with his own love life. A talented painter, estranged from his father. A daughter who is in her last year at high school and is a cheerleader and desperate to be popular. The usual adolescent stuff. And a husband who was laid off from the infotech department at LLB, and I rather like that detail, and has been out of work for 18 months. So this is a family of four getting by on her very middle-class salary of $51,500 a year. These are people who live in a house that needs a lot of work. They drive 9-year-old cars. They don't get to travel. They don't get to buy, nice clothes. They get by. And Laura basically finds her husband increasingly distant, estranged, not there, withdrawn, depressed fundamentally. He can't find anything. And she's turning around at 41 and just going, is this my life? It's suddenly starting to kind of gain gravitas in her, the fact that this is her existence, and although it's not terrible, it doesn't have a huge outlook to it. Life seems blocked. And then she gets to go away for a weekend to a radiography conference, which is being held in a terrible airport hotel. They're always held in terrible airport hotels in Boston. And while checking in, she meets a man in his 50s named Richard, who has a little insurance company in Bath, Maine, a rather gray, unassuming man who has a salesman's pattern, and they just sort of exchange pleasantries. And she says goodbye as she checks in and just thinks, God, what a boring little man. Some hours later, by accident in Cambridge, they meet up again, and he proposes a drink, and they sit down and begin to talk. These are two people who, in their own way, have sort of... I've often said that people actually... When someone says, oh, somebody is boring, I always say, no one's boring. That's actually a terrible thing to say. No life is actually fundamentally uninteresting. Everyone has a story. Every life is in its own way a novel. And actually, so often people sublimate so much that is interesting about themselves. They shortchange themselves. They self-thwart. And these two people are two people who have done just that. They both discover a love of words. They both actually are fascinated by semantics, and they're both readers. This has been their escapes. And they're both basically in marriages which, it might not be George and Martha from Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, but at the same time, they've flatlined. They're just, in their own way, dead. And suddenly, they begin to spark something in each other. So what I've written is a classic brief encounter story. The moment that can either change everything or not. And I think, one of the interesting things about love, if especially if you've encountered it in midlife, and I can say that because I got remarried in the last year, is what is surprising about it is the fact that it is, to use a word I use all the time, happenstantial. You are sort of going along this road, and someone steps into your path, and it's like, oh my God, how did that happen? And what's interesting is fundamentally also, I've always hated a word in the American lexicon which is far too overused, especially on certain afternoon TV programs like Dr. Phil, which is closure. I hate that word. Closure sort of assumes the idea that if something terrible happens to you, you can eventually put it in a box, put it on a shelf, close the closet door, and be done with it. That's nonsense. I mean, like everyone, I was hearing the news this morning on NPR about Oklahoma and those children who drowned in that school. And, there's no way those parents are ever going to achieve closure about that. None whatsoever. I mean, that's an absurd. There will be accommodation eventually, because there has to be, because you have to move on with life, but they will not move on without actually, essentially, having this profound grief. And just a digression for a moment. I was saying this to my daughter recently, who's 17. When my daughter was 10, her best friend was knocked down and killed by a car 2 streets away from us in London. And I watched my daughter's childhood crack in half on the spot. For the first time recently, she was able to talk about Molly, the girl, 7 years later. And I said to her, you know, when you are even a bit older, you will look back on this time and realize that something fundamentally changed in you. I mean, 10-year-olds should not be, at 10, maybe your grandfather dies, but not a classmate. And you should not have that kind of notion of mortality and the fragility of life pushed directly into your face. But I said to her as well, I said, and you know this, life has the capacity for the wondrous and also the tragic. And actually, I think if I went around this room and I asked everyone, no one here probably has dodged tragedy. And this is something we tend to sort of avoid talking about, especially with kids at, you know, of late adolescent stage or at college age. The fact that life is going to deal you some very good cards maybe, and some actually very terrible ones. And no one escapes that. No one whatsoever escapes that. And how you deal with that determines so much. It was something that sort of interests me, and this is sort of, you know, I remember running into a woman I knew, an agent in London, around the time of my own divorce, and I'd heard that, you know, she and her husband had broken up, and her husband had run off with a Swedish yoga instructor. Isn't that classic? And I ran into Louise on the street, and someone told me, sort of in a very catty London way, if you run into Louise, she will begin to sing you a sort of Gotterdammerung-length aria about the terribleness of her divorce. And sure enough, I ran into Louise in Chelsea, and she fell in part in front of me. It's so terrible, it's terrible. And I turned to her and I said, you know what? Keith, that's the ex, he always struck me as one of the most boring men I've ever met in my life. I said in my very direct American way. So, you know, I said, you'll get through this. And she said, you don't understand, it's too horrible, it's too difficult. I'll never get over it. And I looked at her, and the words just came to me, and it actually got me thinking about a lot of things in life. I just said, well, if you see it that way, that's simply a choice. You know, and I think so much in life, going back to that whole notion of interpretation, especially if terrible things come to you, is a choice. I mean, and the choice may be conditioned by your own childhood, your own psychological makeup, but you've seen probably people who have dealt with stuff that is like the book of Job, in terms of just terrifying things that have befallen them, terrible things, and then and have actually managed to somehow persevere, and other people at the same time where 1 or 2 small things completely upend them totally, and they can't seem to get beyond that. Why is that? I'm not a shrink. I'm married to one, but I'm not a shrink. But that interests me as well as a writer. Just that whole idea of how you interpret that which comes into your past. And I think, you know, in love, for example, are we attracted to the possibility of change? And yet change always involves a considerable amount of complexity and is dangerous. Do we fall in love because this is the person who's right for us, or because the timing is right, or because the timing is actually wrong? Or because we're simply open to the possibility of love. In the moment, a character who's a CIA man explains to my narrator, Thomas, the theory of radar, and how radar is an interesting metaphor for love. I don't know if you know that radar was invented, the Navy here started to work on it, but the Brits basically cracked it in the early years of the war when the word came up from Churchill and the War Cabinet to Cambridge, which was the big scientific university. Essentially, U-boats were pounding them, and they just said, we need to find a way of tracking them. And what the scientists at Cambridge worked out, and just think about this vis-a-vis love, was create a magnetic field between 2 objects. There's love for you, a magnetic field. One object sends an image out towards the other, a signal out towards the other. But what bounces back to the first object is not an actual representation of that object. It's the image that has been projected onto it. Do you wonder why the rate of divorce is so high? If you think about it, so often we're not falling in love with the other person, we're falling in love with that which we so desperately want, and that which we sort of impose onto that person. So, you know, this also brings me back to that other question I was saying, which is, do we choose unhappiness? Like that woman I was talking about on the street. My maternal grandfather, my mother's Jewish, my father's Irish Catholic, which is why guilt is everywhere in my novels. But my maternal grandfather, Milton L. Braun, who was raised in Yorkville, who stood about that high, and was the last man in New York to wear spats. And he had a jewelry business in the Diamond District, and he was in a long and really terrible marriage. But his favorite joke, I don't know if you know this, which is about the husband and wife in front of a divorce judge. And the judge turns to the husband and goes, "Mr. Leibowitz, why do you want to divorce your wife? She's a pain in the ass. Mrs. Leibowitz, he's a schmuck. All right, I can see you're incompatible, but let me ask you something. You're both 98 years old. Why have you waited so long to get a divorce?" And the woman looks at him and goes, "We wanted to wait until the children were dead." So, going back to that story I told about my father, do we stay put because we are frightened of the unknown, or because in a way, and I think that's another thing as well, people develop their own weather systems, and they live within them. And unhappiness is frequently, or just sort of a state of, oh well, this is it, becomes sort of the weather system in which we sort of can dwell. And it's one of the reasons why I think probably the most challenging word out there is change. Change is so hard because it is essentially saying, I want to move beyond that, but to do so, I actually have to start thinking in a different way. I think, I'm always very empathetic to anyone who says, I have to stay, I just can't do it. Because I think change is actually, on any level, whether it's a personal change, a professional change, just a shift in yourself, it's the most complex and challenging thing we come up against, because basically, in a way, in that creation of the identity and the creation of the weather system, getting outside of that is very hard. And it also comes down to that question which that German woman asked her boyfriend up in Laos, which I think remains actually the most difficult question out there. What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? It's an enormous question, and it's also something that changes, I think, completely throughout your life. If you think you think you know what you want, maybe at 21, and then at 40, and maybe at 50, where mortality is beginning to kind of creep into your thinking, it changes completely. The thing is, Laura in this novel, she doesn't really know what she wants. She'd like a happier marriage, but she sees that's going to be impossible. But she starts to know what she doesn't want. And I think, actually, if you start to figure out what you don't want in life, that is not bad progress. And before I take questions, just on that note, I don't read much, but I'm going to read just the last page of the book, and I promise I'm not going to give anything away. You're not going to find out about the Trojan horse or anything like that. But this fundamentally, I think, talks very much about the heart of the novel. It's also about the way I kind of look at the world. Laura has been through this very big experience, and she's just given a scan on a lawyer who is pregnant in her early 40s and is certain she has breast cancer. One of the things that actually the technologist told me, which I love, she said, I really hate the internet because most patients spend so much time on the Mayo Clinic website. I have a lot of nodding in the audience here. Yes, terrifying themselves to death. And this woman has basically, she's a very high-powered lawyer, very neurotic, and she's refused a mammogram. She's insisted on an MRI, basically because she's certain it has metastasized. And Laura has just run the scan. And she says, I peered out again at this anguished, frightened woman, my contemporary, and so much a fellow sufferer. In a moment, I would reach for the microphone and tell her that the scan was over and compliment her on her bravery and brace myself for an onslaught of questions. What did you see? You've got to tell me. Is it malignant? Is it benign? What did you see? As soon as I walked back in to release her from the beer. Were this my world, and it's nobody's world, what would I actually say besides the fact that the lump is benign? What piece of counsel might I impart to her? Not wisdom, because one person's wisdom is another person's cliches. And as there are absolutely no answers to life's larger conundrums, it might be something as simple and as blunt as this. Amid all the fear, the doubt, the longing, the setbacks, the hope for something better, the sense that you have boxed yourself in, amid all the internal struggle you will always have with yourself, and the realization that everything is so profoundly temporal, there is what the screen in front of me tells me, that growth within you will not kill you. And even if, from this moment on, you continue to block yourself, disappoint yourself, lock yourself into an existence you know you don't want, the screen still says, all clear. There is a chance now. But if, in the end, you can't convert that chance into change, there is still one great consolation if you choose to see it. You're going to live. Thank you. If there are questions, I'm here. I would love a glass of water. Could I have a glass of water, please? Yeah, hi.
I could have prefaced this by saying my writing teacher told me to come here. And when I read the scenario of your book and realized it was about a woman who goes to a conference, and then it seems to have an affair, and I had just gone to a conference 2 weeks ago. I suspected, I was wondering what we thought was going on.
Thank you so
But
much.
my question is really about the free-form nature of your writing. And do you ever get to a point where you're questioning the morality of your characters, and do you pull them out of situations because you don't like what they're doing?
I think what's interesting about my characters is they're like their creator, very flawed, you know, and probably like everyone in this room. And I'm actually someone who, I think when I was younger, I was very judgmental because I'm from Manhattan, and I was, I was a bit of too much of a smart guy. I think, life has told me to actually just step back and always look at the complexity surrounding a situation. This is interesting because in this book, an affair, an adulterous affair, actually proves to be transformative. It's a good thing. And the sex is good too. And that can actually, in France, that's fine. But in certain places, it can get under people's skin. I don't take a judgmental view on that, except, basically for Laura, she's somebody who probably never would have done it, except the fact that, she'd been pushed so far away from her by her husband. And, the thing is, I think what's always important when you're writing is there are certain kind of writers who will give you kind of moralistic tales and, will kind of tie things up neatly. I'm interested, as I said earlier, in mess. Most life is very messy. And there is never really there's rarely a right or wrong. There really rarely is. And I think what you have to do is try to be true at least to a certain kind of emotional veracity about just how people operate. Not really about whether it's right or wrong, but why people make decisions at a certain time, why this happens, what's going on. And I've often felt behind most things, if you let's say most kind of major human decisions, or maybe something stupid like falling into bed with somebody at a conference. This is not in this case, but There are 5 things going on, 3 of which the person themselves doesn't completely understand. There's a great line of Kierkegaard's, how life has to be lived forward and understood backwards. You know, you live, you make decisions, you do things come your way, you say yes, you say no, you know. It can be big, it can be small, whatever. And then, boom. Yeah, happenstance is also, it's one of those interesting things. In 1983, just a story, I was at the Abbey Theatre in Dublin. This is in an earlier part of my life. I ran their experimental theatre for 5 years. This is my Orson Welles phase. And I had produced a friend's film for Irish TV. I took some time off, and it was at a film festival in Glasgow. And I was there, and it was the first night of the festival, and I was at the bar, and I was talking to this very attractive young solicitor from Edinburgh, who had a very Morningside accent. I won't imitate it, but a very high-class Edinburgh accent, and who was obviously deciding I was an idiot and wanted to get away after about half an hour. So we've been propping up the bar, and she said, I've got to go, and she did. And I was staying in a hotel on the other side of town, and basically I went to the desk and said, could you call me a cab? The cab drove up, I stepped out, and there was a Glaswegian drunk, and they really make them mean in Glasgow. He looked like a pit bull, and he was with this blonde who didn't exactly look like she had a PhD from Oxford. And he said, that's my cab, Jimmy. And I said, you know what? It is, sir, because I could see if I said no, I'd probably be picking up my teeth with broken fingers. And I said, of course it's your cab, sir. Go with God. Take it. Good night. And I went back inside. And I said, I think I need another cab. And at that precise moment, a woman who I knew from Dublin who worked for the Irish Film Board named Grace Carley walked in. And she went, Douglas, Grace. I'd asked her out once, months ago. And she was with some guy at the time. And she said, I said, do you want to have a drink? And she said, fine. That's where I met my wife. Now, I thought about that during our divorce. I said, life would have been very different, a lot cheaper if I'd taken the cab. But my point is, life works that way. You know, it just does. You think you can sort of, and I just think this about morality as well, you know. You can kind of superimpose your own ideas on somebody's morality, you know. How could Clinton have done that with Monica Lewinsky? There are probably many reasons, half of which he doesn't understand. You know what I mean? And you don't know what the dynamic of that marriage was, what the sexual dynamic, all this comes into it. I think, you know, I think you just have to write a kind of a certain emotional veracity about the characters for themselves and make it real. And I think that's the other thing as well, is, I mean, you owe it to yourself or to your readers to reflect life's larger contradictions. Because life is contradictory. And we all make mistakes. And, you know, as I said earlier, everyone's biggest argument is with themselves. Yes, ma'am.
Am I correct? Did you say you were born in Brooklyn? You lived in Brooklyn?
My parents are from Brooklyn. I was born on 19th Street I was born in New York Hospital, but I was raised on 19th Street and 2nd Avenue, which back then was a rather middle-class part of Manhattan. Still is, actually. One of the rare ones. But my parents are from Prospect Heights, my dad, and my mother from Flatbush.
How did you get to England or Ireland or
I went over for my junior year at Trinity College Dublin. And I didn't go on a program. I just went as a guest student. I showed up in Dublin and I was accepted with a suitcase, my third year at Bowdoin. I thought Dublin was like the back end of Brooklyn, you know, at the time. And by the time I sort of left the year, it corrupted me terribly in all sorts of good ways. I worked off-Broadway after college as a stage manager and was sort of trying to get going in the theater there. There was a lot of family pressure to do something sensible, like be a lawyer or something like that. I went off for a couple of weeks to Ireland. I had some money in the bank, and I basically didn't come back. I started a theater company, which got known in Dublin. I lived a properly bohemian existence. I mean, I read a piece about this for The Independent in London, and it was fascinating. I mean, I lived my first year on $1,500, which I cobbled together with this little company. You could do it. You know, I had no family money. I didn't want it anyway, even if I did. And basically sort of made my way from there. And a year and a half into this job at the Abbey opened up. And I didn't think they would hire an American, and they did. And I was there for 5 years, and I started to write at night. So I mean, I had a long burn. I actually left the Abbey, the Peacock, which I ran in 1983 when I was 28, determined to become a writer. I'd had a couple of things done on the BBC, on the radio, and little things, and I did a lot of journalism in Dublin and wrote more radio plays and had a disastrous stage play done at the Peacock, which played to a handful of agoraphobics. No one showed up, you know. As I said, you could have landed a small Cessna in the auditorium by the time it ended. And then wrote my first book, which was called Beyond the Pyramids, which was based on a journey I made in Egypt. And I'd found an English publisher, and I moved to London with my then wife. And you know, writing is not something, I said this recently to a group of students at the University of Avignon. Someone said, "How do I get to be you?" which was funny. And I said, "All right, do you like being by yourself?" And I'm not just talking about physically, but existentially. Do you actually can you kind of go into battle with yourself every day, just about doing the work? Because that's what it's about. Also, how well do you take rejection and disappointment? Because there's going to be plenty. And do you have 20 years? That was the part they really didn't like. You know, we live in a very sort of idea of instant celebrity culture, and I believe in the idea of a career. You know, I've never written the same book twice. My success first came in Europe and is now kind of building here. And fundamentally, it's just about writing the next book for me. You know, even this afternoon, I had some time off between Fairfield and my talk here tonight, and I found a cafe, you know, in Fairfield, was playing really bad Italian pop music, but they do a good cappuccino. And I worked there for 90 minutes and wrote 400 words of the next novel, because I had to do that today. That's la vida. That's the writer's life. It's just, you push it forward every day. Ma'am.
Are you happiest when you're in your writing mode? Is that a good, is that your best level of happiness?
Yeah, I was being interviewed by the Financial Times about 4 weeks ago when I was in England, and they asked that question, and the answer I replied was, I'm actually happiest when I write the last sentence. It's almost like the gym, you know. I don't like doing it, but I like the result. But fundamentally, I do love what I do, and I do like writing. But it took me a long time to get there. I would not say that it was easy. I've had a lot of doubt at first. It really was a long burn upwards. And I also never think you're ever going to... My grandfather, who I mentioned before, had a great line. I mean, he once said to me two things. Never put yourself up for sale, you'll go cheap, which I loved. But also, he said, never fall in love with the aroma of your own perfume. And I think that's actually very good advice, especially if you've had some success in the arts. Because you're fortunate and you're rare, and I know this. To do what I do and to be able to make a nice living out of it and live here and there, it's unusual. And I'm very grateful, and I don't have to teach. And I don't have to do journalism anymore. I write movies.
But you're grateful. That's great.
But I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful.
To be in the state of...
Sure, I'm very grateful. And I know it's because it's funny. I was having dinner the other night, about 10 days ago, and I was back seeing my daughter in London with a very good friend of mine. And, you know, she's an English novelist, and we've known each other since, '88. And she's in the middle of a divorce, and we were just talking about that. But, you know, we sat there, and we knew each other when we were both in our early 30s in London. And, you know, Louise is published by Frost House here and Faber there. She's, you know, she's never sort of made it in a big way, but she's very good, and hopefully it'll happen. But we were just saying, and we started talking about everyone we knew back then. And, you know, that's really where my career began in London. And I knew about 35 young writers. We were all getting published. There are about 5 of us around now, you know, 25 years on.
That's about right.
Yeah, it's.
And now you're double that age.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you look forward to for the next doubling?
I would like to get a huge public in America. That's the one thing I would like, you know. But I think that will just happen through the work and through people getting to know my books. You know, that's the one thing I would like, because I have that everywhere else. And I'd like to have that in my own country. And I think it's coming slowly but surely. But I mean, beyond that, honestly, just writing. You know, the next book. That's all I think about. You know, there's a great, I mean, I think my favorite American poet is Emily Dickinson, because she always cuts to the heart of the matter, and you know, she's quoted a lot in 5 days, but certainly After Great Pain, which is actually, I think, one of the best titles ever written, After Great Pain. Isn't that wonderful? But she has another very short poem, which is called Fame as a Bee. 4 lines. Fame as a bee, it has a song, it has a sting, Act 2, it has a wing.
Yes.
And, you know, success is a very fragile veneer, and fundamentally you should, you know, it's wonderful to have it, but there's always the next book. And I think this is true not just in a writing life, it's true in every aspect of life, you know. The moment you take something for granted or someone for granted is the moment it actually begins, or they begin to slip away.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think I'm always conscious of that and just getting on with the next book.
What do you wish for your daughter?
I hope she's Judi Dench. She wants to be an actress. Oh yes, she wants to be an actress. Yeah. So, and she was raised there, so she's English, and she's trying out for the big drama schools. And I actually have he's well known in England, an actor friend who I just said work with her for 2 sessions and see what you think. And he said to me she has the chops, but now it's a matter of getting her into those schools. And as I said to her recently, you know, be prepared for a lot of setbacks and a lot of no's. And you know, how you weather that is going to determine a lot, which is, I think, true in life. Not even, you know, it doesn't have to be the arts, you know. And my son wants to be a filmmaker, so there we are. Did you have a question?
I do have a question. Can you tell us about the woman in the fifth and your film writing?
Yeah. I've written 11 novels. 3 of them have been made into movies, which is actually a pretty good yield. There's one good film. And that's the film of The Big Picture, which was on the art house circuit here. You know, played places like the Angelica and the Lincoln Plaza. And you can get on Netflix. It's a French movie. It's an adaptation of the novel with Romain Doris, who's a very hot actor, and Catherine Deneuve. I thought that was really chic. Catherine Deneuve in a novel of mine. It's a complete...
So what's the name of the movie?
Vous êtes française?
Oui.
Voilà, bienvenue. On va parler après. Ok, voilà. Ça, c'est ma deuxième langue. Vous avez grandi où?
France.
Mais où en France?
Maybe I continue.
Ok.
Mais
après?
French, from French parents, but I've lived in Darien for 7 years now.
Ok. On va parler après. You know, but basically, it's in French, it's L'homme qui voulait vivre sa vie, which is the name of the novel there. He took the novel and redid it as a French story. And as I said to Eric Latigo, who is the director, and French is my other language, as you can gather, but I'd read a screenplay and we talked in Paris, and I just said, make a good movie. You know, keep the spirit of the book there, and I'll be happy. The film of The Woman in the Fifth, I did the screenplay, and then the director, who was a Polish gentleman named Paweł Pawłowski, rewrote it heavily. My version got Kristen Scott Thomas and Ethan Hawke aboard. Paweł, who is very much a kind of tortured Polish director, that's a tautology, I think. But anyway, he basically made a film that I just didn't like.
You lost control, really.
Well, no, it's not. No, the thing about movies, you have no control. You know, if they want to put a dinosaur into your story, they can. You have no control, and if you want to have control, don't ever. You know, I've often said, you know, it's selling the rights of a movie to a producer. It's like getting into bed with somebody you know is crazy. You know, it might be sexy. It may be fun, you know, but you're going to wake up to a nut, next to a nut. It's the same thing. And you basically abnegate all kind of control over the film once you sell it.
But you did the screenplay?
I did the screenplay, but he was the director. The director is the king, and he rewrote it. And I said, I read the script, I didn't like it, and I said to the producers, by this point he and I were talking anyway, for a variety of boring reasons. But I basically said to the producers, on verra, we'll see. You know, and then I saw the film 8 months later, and I just said, it's a bad movie, I'm taking my name off the script. You can say from the novel by. and the film died, you know. So there you go. The film of the big picture essentially was released in 20 countries, and in France alone it sold 1.2 million tickets. You know, the film of the woman in the fifth in France sold 30,000. What does this tell you? The thing about the movie business, I mean, I'm in the middle of a negotiation with 5 Days with the producer if he ever gets the money together in Hollywood. It's a nice sideline. I like writing screenplays, but they're nothing to do with my work as a novelist. A screenplay is a very different creature because you're telling the story in a completely different narrative way. To begin with, you know, you can only write a page a minute. This is almost a 300-page book. If you write a 300-page screenplay, you've written Lawrence of Arabia, you know, or Gone with the Wind. The rule is 1 page, 1 minute. And you essentially have to be very reductionist. Scenes start in the middle. You cannot describe a lot. You know, in a screenplay, in a novel, I could describe the lighting here. I could describe what you're wearing. I could describe my thoughts. In a screenplay, it's interior, you know, library, night. Douglas is giving an address. And 1 or 2 other things, dialogue. And you actually have to build scenically, and I know this from writing screenplays, in a very, very concentrated manner. A novel has far more liberty. And eventually then a director's going to take it over and do what the hell he or she wants. And you also have to understand that. So it's a nice sideline.